and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 4 for Sunday, 12th of March 2017, and today's movie is Zack Snyder's 300. My name is Andrew Blischek, and with me as ever is Martin Darlington.
Hello everybody. In researching for this, Andrew and I have had a look and realised this may run rather long. It's either that or we chop a lot of content out, and there's quite a lot to talk about here. In the news, a couple of sites that you guys and girls might find interesting. The Ancient Greece podcast is definitely worth looking at. It's the address is thehistoryofancientgreece.com, all lowercase. And their Twitter address is @GreecePodcast. And interestingly, they are in the process of covering the Persian Wars. So if listening to our show today sparks your interest in that period, you can get all the lead up and Thermopylae and the Spartans and the aftermath with the Ancient Greece podcast.
Also, another site worth visiting is Not Historians.
Yeah, their Twitter address is @NotHistorians.
Yeah, like
capital
us.
N, capital H.
Thanks, Martin. Like us, a couple of amateur history buffs putting out their take on history and digging into interesting tidbits behind the main stories.
And if you'd like a 5-minute potted history of the period that we're covering today, the Battle of Thermopylae, there's a very funny but very, very well researched and delivered potted history on hilarious helmet histories on YouTube. So if you just put in hilarious helmet histories in the search bar, and it's episode 1, Why the Persians Should Have Been the Good Guys. It's very funny, but it is also very well appointed.
And in this episode, we're also introducing some new sound effects, which, if something is said that is really wrong, will play. And if the movie gets something properly correct, we'll also play.
And if you guys and girls are enjoying the show, please share it with your friends, colleagues, relatives, colleagues, tennis partners, and anyone else you bump into. And if you use iTunes, it does help tremendously to spread the word. If you could write a brief review or a long one, either way, we would be extremely grateful. Now, before we launch into the show itself, we are going to try a slightly different format this week due to the nature of some of the material we're covering and the depth we'd like to give it. That we're going to do a story of the movie and then a bit of reality check background information to what was going on in Greece and the Peloponnese at this time. And then we're going to do a bit of the movie, a bit of reality check, a bit more of the movie, rather than do the whole movie synopsis followed by the whole reality check. I hope it works, I hope you enjoy it, and here is the show.
300. First of all, the story of the movie. 300 is a 2006 epic fantasy film based on a 1990s comic book series of the same name by Frank Miller and Lynn Varney. The comics and this movie are an imagined retelling of the famous Battle of Thermopylae, where legend has it 300 brave but doomed Spartans held off the mighty invading Persian Empire for some time. Their sacrifice inspired the Greek-speaking world to eventually unite and ultimately defeat the Persians. The movie 300 is directed by Zack Snyder, who eventually went on to direct other comic book-related movies such as Watchmen and then several DC comic franchise movies. To retain a comic book-like feel, the movie is shot in a sepia-tone chroma key style, and I imagine most of the movie was shot with the actors in front of a green screen and all the details added later through some computer-generated technology.
The movie was received to very polarised reviews. It either seemed you loved it or you hated it. It was nominated for and won some second-tier awards, such as a 2007 MTV Movie Award. The comic book style exaggeration of villains and perfectly abbed-up heroes meant the movie was an easy parody target. Lots of comedy shows took it on, including Saturday Night Live and South Park, and it even got its own commercially successful parody movie in 2008 titled Meet the Spartans. Despite the mixed reviews and an R rating due to the graphic violence, the film was a commercial success. It cost about $65 million to make, and it took over $450 million at the box office, and spawned a moderately successful 2014 sequel, 300 Rise of an Empire. The movie runs for 1 hour and 56 minutes and was shot in studios and on set in Montreal and Los Angeles.
Okay, so what's the actual source material that we're going to look at when we compare the movie to history? Most famous source material is Herodotus from the 5th century BCE, Xenophon from the 5th and 4th century BCE, and Plutarch a few hundred years later in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. And he drew on Herodotus pretty much. So where are we set? Sparta is a city, now a small city of about 35,000 people living in its municipality and called Sparta or Spartae, depending on what map you consult, in the Peloponnese, about 100 miles southwest of Athens. The Peloponnese Peninsula is very nearly an island corresponding to mainland Greece, much in the same way that Sicily does to Italy, with a narrow land bridge connecting the two near the ancient city of Corinth.
The southern part of the peninsula is also known as Laconia, with Sparta as its capital. Legend had it that Lacedaemon, an ancient king of the area and a son of Zeus and Taygete, married his niece Sparta and renamed this area in her honour. But in ancient text, Lacedaemonian is often used as an alternative to Spartan when referring to the people. Another mythical early Spartan was Lycurgus, or Lycurgus. He was not a king, but a senior royal advisor who devised the agoge system, which is a former military school for 7 to 18-year-old Spartan boys, more of which later. And he urged his fellow citizens to embrace austerity, strength, fitness, and equality for all male citizens. And it's from this idea of eschewing luxury that we use the modern adjective Spartan to describe anything that's bare, utilitarian, or in someone living in harsh conditions.
He established a senate of 28 senior citizens to balance the power of the two kings. The kings were hereditary, drawn from the Agid or Eurypontids, respectively, but after Lycurgus's reforms could be deposed. What isn't mentioned at all in the movie is how the Spartans were able to have all their military-age men in the army and still feed themselves, arm themselves, and carry out the functions of an ancient large city. This was due to the Helots, fellow Greeks that Sparta had conquered years before and were provided as slaves to the Spartans for over 300 years. Some Helots also served in the Spartan army as light troops, but generally were employed to feed, equip and house the citizenry.
Okay, so opening scenes. The movie opens in 479 BC with our narrator Dilios, played by Australian actor David Wenham, setting the scene for how the Greeks and Persians came to meet 1 year earlier at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. To help us understand the context for this, one of the most famous battles in Western civilization, Dilios tells us about the childhood challenges of the Greek Spartan king Leonidas. Like all Spartan children, Leonidas was inspected at birth, and as he had no observable weaknesses or deformities, was spared an instant death and commenced the brutal training of a young Spartan noble in the art of war and self-defence.
Spartans, you see, never give up, never surrender, and value death in battle over all else. At the age of 7, Leonidas leaves the family home and is trained to fight, take punishment, survive and persevere. The montage of brutality and violence includes a scene where the young Leonidas, alone and in the frozen mountains, is hunted by a fierce Greek wolf. The young Leonidas turns the tables and spears the howling wolf to a painful death. That's the first 6 minutes of the movie. So we have it established that Sparta is a harsh place, which breeds the toughest, most ruthless soldiers in the ancient world, and the toughest, most ruthless soldier of them all is their now adult king, Leonidas.
So, here we go with our first reality check. It is true that any baby showing signs of deformity will be taken to the slopes of Mount Taygetus and either left there for the gods to decide its fate, or, according to some writings, thrown into a chasm, although none of the contemporary sources mention this. They would just basically leave the baby on the hillside. It's worth noting this was not uncommon in other Greek city-states, including Athens. Boys were taken from their families aged 7 to undergo the agoge, where they would spend over 10 years being trained to take their place in the Spartan heavy infantry units that made up the army. Spartan girls, unlike the rest of Greece at this time, also underwent an education, learning not only what were considered womanly skills, but they'd also take part in athletics and wrestling.
Spartan women often attended and even spoke at the regular political meetings, whereas in Athens, often lauded as a birthplace of democracy, women were hardly seen and definitely not heard. Once a woman was married in Athenian society, she would be hidden away from the world and her husband's friends, not even naming her for fear of causing some offence. Sparta itself was a city with no walls, the idea being that the most effective wall the army had was its hoplites, the Greek term for the heavy infantry armed with a bronze shield, long heavy spear and short stabbing sword. The Spartans boasted that their wall of bronze was better than any wall of wood or stone.
Leonidas becomes king around 490 BC, succeeding his older half-brother Cleomenes, who died in slightly mysterious circumstances, possibly suicide, possibly murdered, but he was definitely an alcoholic. And again, what isn't mentioned in the movie is Spartans always had two kings. So Leonidas was Leonidas' co-king. Leonidas was married to Gorgo, portrayed in the movie by Lena Headey. Anyone who's watched Game of Thrones, she's Cersei, playing a similar role of a strong woman, but without the incest, the regicide, the murderous plotting. Gorgo was the daughter of late King Cleomenes and therefore the niece of Leonidas, but this was far from unusual. And at the time of Thermopylae, he was certainly in his late 50s and possibly in his early 60s, so a very experienced commander, but not a buff 30-something as portrayed by Gerard Butler.
Martin, you mentioned that the Spartans had two kings. Is there some link that the Romans claim to their two dual consulships renewed each year to the tough Spartans that they're trying to emulate?
There may well be. I mean, the Roman legend is that they're the descendants of Aeneas, who escaped, who was a Trojan, escaping the Greeks at the siege of Troy, and found his way to the Valley of Seven Hills, which obviously becomes Rome. There's no archaeological evidence for that. But certainly, as we will see, the Spartans have had an incredible impact on Western conscience, particularly civilizations who fancy themselves as militaristic.
Okay, well, back to the movie. Next in the movie we get the ambassadors arriving and the preparation for war. Our narrator, Dilios, now tells us that Leonidas needs to lead the defence of the Greek-speaking world against the vast hordes of the invading Persian army, led by their god king Xerxes. The adult Leonidas, played by British actor Gerard Butler, meets the Persian ambassador who hopes to stare the Spartans down. Here we also meet Gorgo, Leonidas' wife, as you say, played by British actress Lena Headey, in what was probably her breakout role. We also meet Theron, a slimy Spartan politician, and Captain Artemis, a long-time loyal friend of Leonidas. Persian ambassador asks Sparta to yield to the massive Persian army by simply offering Xerxes some Spartan earth and water. That will symbolically mean that Sparta is now under Persian control and all other aspects of Spartan life can continue unchanged. The soft Athenians, a bunch of philosophers and boy lovers, had already defied Persia on such a deal, so why wouldn't Sparta? Leonidas and Sparta will, of course, have none of this yielding to Persian nonsense, and in the most undiplomatic of moves, Leonidas throws the ambassador to his death in a well, where he'll get plenty of earth and plenty of water.
And let's now hear Gerard Butler, as King Leonidas, get very shouty.
This is blasphemy! This is madness!
Madness. This is Sparta!
So, there we have it. Leonidas gets very loud and kicks the ambassador into the well. This is actually the opposite of how Spartans behaved. They were famous for using very few words. They didn't use battle cries, which we'll hear the movie get wrong a bit later. They would sing paeans, which are similar to hymns before battle. But their big thing was they did not display emotion, as they saw it as a sign of weakness, and this went to the mothers and the wives as well. We mentioned earlier they were often referred to as Lacedaemonians, and it is from this we get our modern word laconic to describe someone who rarely wastes words or emotion. So the Persian ambassadors had indeed arrived to demand offerings of earth and water from each of the Greek city-state. These were the Persian tokens of submission. They didn't ask for treasure or money, simply give us the earth, give us the water, and if we call you, you come to the King of Kings' demands. Normally that would be for troops. It has to be said the Persians ruled with a very light touch. Each nation within its empire continued to worship their own gods, continued their societies they always had done within the limits of Persian law. Each nation also fought in their traditional manner with their traditional weapons, although there is some evidence that some standardization of equipment did occur during the development of the Persian army.
The Achaemenid Persian Empire under Darius, Xerxes' father, at one point ruled an estimated 44% of the world's population at the time. By population, this is a larger empire that has been seen before or since. The incident where the ambassador is killed was reported by Herodotus, but occurred before Leonidas became king and over 10 years before the engagement at Thermopylae. Herodotus tells us that Athens buried their Persian ambassadors, while the Spartans threw theirs into the well, thereby jointly satisfying the demand for earth and water. Whether true or not is open to speculation.
The initial demand for earth and water came not from Xerxes, but from his father Darius, who was targeting certain Greek cities for supporting a revolt of the Ionian cities populated by Greeks, but within the Persian Empire. And this all happened in 490 BC. The refusal of Sparta and Athens led to the first great Persian invasion, culminating in the Great Battle of Marathon, where the Greek hoplites defeated a much larger Persian force. The Spartans rather awkwardly missed this battle because they had religious commitments at home, and they were incredibly committed to their religious commitments. This is where we get the story of an Athenian messenger, Pheidippides, said by legend to have run 26 miles to Athens to announce the victory before dropping dead from exhaustion. Although Herodotus' only mention of him is that he was sent to Sparta to ask for help in the coming battle before the battle actually started, a distance of over 100 miles that he completed in 2 days, then ran back. The first reference to Pheidippides, or Philippides, as he sometimes appeared, running to Athens, appears much later in other histories.
Whatever the truth, that's the origin of our modern 26-mile marathon race. After his defeat, Darius intended to return to Greece, but dies in 486 BC. Xerxes began preparing an invasion force, but a revolt in Egypt diverted him until 480, when he finally moved against the defiant Greeks.
It's worth noting as well, Xerxes' army's movement when he did get round to invading the Greek peninsula is an incredible achievement in itself. In days before properly prepared roads, he had to stockpile food and supplies along the route before they set out. Then they had to cross the Hellespont, the strip of water that divides Asia Minor from Europe, and is at its narrowest point over a mile wide. But Xerxes' men, not wanting to rely on their navy, constructed a bridge of boats, like a pontoon bridge. Their first attempt failed, but they persevered, and that's how they got across the water. Quite incredible engineering feat.
Well, they sort of mention that in the movie, don't they? At one stage, when they're trying to scare the Spartans, they say that the mighty army of Xerxes will drink rivers dry. And yeah, I've heard that reference before, that they were such a horde that they, bend nature to their will.
I mean, we're going to debunk a lot of the portrayals of Xerxes in this movie, but he obviously had a little bit of a god complex going on, because when the first attempt failed to build a pontoon bridge due to a storm that blew up, he had his men flog the water and throw iron fetters, chains with manacles attached into the water to tell the sea that it was subservient to his will. But it clearly worked, because they got across at the second attempt.
And they did get the earth and water thing. When I was watching the movie, I thought that was a bit of exaggeration, but it was historically accurate about the killing of the ambassador.
Yeah, and that was something you just didn't do. This is where the character says this is barbarism, this is obscene. He's quite right. You did not kill heralds, because in the days before telephones and internet and the like, potentially conflicting states would communicate through heralds. And there are a number of cases through history where the heralds would be murdered, but it was generally seen as a pretty bad thing to do, pretty dumb thing to do as well. Okay, moving on to the next scene.
Yes, back to the movie. So what we've got now is, after the death of the ambassador, it's obvious that a clash between Persia and Sparta is now inevitable. But first, Leonidas must get the blessing for war from the ancient Spartan priests, the ephors. They're portrayed in the movie as lecherous, deformed and pox-ridden creatures, and for the first time in the movie we get to see some sort of exaggerated, mythical creatures who, according to the movie, lived amongst us in the ancient world. They have an oracle, a female, a nymph-like creature who goes into a trippy trance, and the ephors listen to her words and declare that her message is that there can be no war against Persia. But soon after that scene, we learn that the ephors and the slimy politician Theron are all in the pocket of Xerxes, who has bribed them to do his bidding. So Leonidas' defence of an independent Sparta is compromised from within. So Leonidas needs to find a way around the oracle's anti-war stance. So he assembles 300 of his best soldiers as his personal bodyguard. And if anyone asks, he's not off to war, but simply taking a stroll with them, all fully armed, northward, which happens to be the direction of Xerxes' army, to the narrow pass at Thermopylae.
So, reality check. Leonidas and his co-king Leotychides II, movie hasn't seemed to have noticed him, they were aware of a prediction by the oracle at Delphi that Sparta would either fall or lose one of its kings. They were both very conscious of this. The ephors, far from being deformed, greedy, otherworldly creatures, they were in fact elders of Sparta who guided and advised the kings, and they did act as high priests. They wanted to make sure that they were not going to break their observance of Carnea, which is a very important religious festival that precluded the deployment of the army. So they actually worked with Leonidas and Leotychides and said, look, if you take your bodyguard, 300 of them, then they're just with you for you to go up and have a look at what the Persians are intending, and that way we won't anger the gods. So they kind of did it as a team rather than in defiance of the ephors.
And I think the movie seems to have borrowed from the oracle at Delphi, who was female and did go into a trippy trance and did talk in, riddles that the priests had to decipher on her behalf. So, I mean, it's not set in Delphi, but that kind of whole imagery was, to some degree, a little bit accurate. Also at the time, Leonidas would have known that he was marching to his death. Gorgo, upon his departure, asked him what she should do. His typically laconic reply is said to have been, "Marry a good man and bear good children." The line, "Come back with your shield or upon it," was a traditional farewell to Spartan soldiers from their wives and mothers. It's interesting to note that in modern times, a military mission that gives little chance of survivors would usually be given to unmarried men so they don't leave anyone grieving back home. The Spartan idea was the opposite, as shown in the movie. Each of Leonidas' 300 had borne a son already, so their bloodlines would survive.
Okay, so back to the movie and the first days of battle. The marching 300 is shadowed by the second deformed mythical beast of the movie, a mysterious spear-carrying hunchback. On their way to Thermopylae, Leonidas is met by some potential Greek allies, some Arcadians on the march against Xerxes. The Arcadians are glad to join the Spartans, but are surprised to see so few. Leonidas points out that whilst the Arcadians are full-time potters or farmers and only part-time soldiers, the only Greeks who are full-time soldiers are his Spartans.
You, there. What is your profession?
I'm a potter.
And you, Arcadian, what is your profession?
Sculptor, sir.
You?
Blacksmith.
Spartans! What is your profession? You see, old friend, I brought more soldiers than you did.
The Spartans and the Arcadians are now marching together and come across a ravaged and burnt Greek town, which Xerxes' elite soldiers, his immortals, have brutally destroyed, massacring its citizens along the way. It's a scene reminiscent of other movie scenes and TV scenes where a sole survivor, a little boy in this instance, narrates the horror that has befallen the people of the city at the hands of the Persians and collapses into Leonidas' arms. When the Spartans and the Arcadians make it to the coast, it's just in time to see hundreds of Persian ships dashed and sunk in a violent storm, leaving the Spartans and the Arcadians to wonder if Zeus and this tempest have done their work for them in defeating the Persians. But the morning reveals the true scale of Xerxes' army. The dozens of ships and thousands of soldiers they saw destroyed the night before are just a small fraction of the invading force now before them.
Another Persian emissary appears, bragging that the Spartans had better yield to Xerxes, the god king. Unsurprisingly, the Spartans resist, and Stelios, a young spirited Spartan played by Michael Fassbender, chops off the ambassador's arm and sends him scurrying back with the unsurprising message of Spartan defiance.
So twice we've had ambassadors coming and trying to get the Spartans on board, and we know they're going to resist, and I think there's a third time this happens in the movie, so
yeah,
a bit of artificial kind of chest beating and defiance by the Spartans in the movie.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality, Herodotus reports upward of 1.5 million soldiers in the Persian army. Modern historians are unanimous in saying that's impossible, but somewhere between 80,000 and 400,000 seems to be more likely. Either way, they hugely outnumber the Greeks, even when combining their forces. What is clear is the Greek force at Thermopylae were not 300 Spartans and a smattering of Arcadians. There were about 7,000 in total, most of them heavy infantry hoplites. The Spartans were certainly acknowledged as the best infantry in Greece, but their allies were no slouches either. And going back to the clip we heard earlier where Leonidas implies that they're amateurs whereas his Spartans are professionals, they're full-time. Yes, the other city soldiers had day jobs, but they were by no means incapable, and there'd be plenty of times when the blacksmiths, sculptors and potters would beat the Spartans. The troops with Leonidas' Spartans came from Corinth, Arcadia, Mantinea, Tegea, Mycenae, Thespia, Thebes, and at Thermopylae they were met by yet more troops who were Phocians and Locrians.
Plus the Spartans had also brought 600 peroikoi, soldiers of their army who enjoyed similar rights to Spartan citizens but weren't full-blood Spartans. They also brought a similar number of helot servants and light infantry. Athens notably didn't send any large numbers of troops to Thermopylae. When Leonidas asked his Spartans what their profession is, the movie has them roar some unintelligible battle cry that sounds like "ooh-ah" repeatedly. This is suspiciously close to the US forces' habit of responding to orders, questions or rousing speeches with "hooah," which apparently stands for heard, understood and acknowledged. And as we mentioned earlier, Spartans didn't do battle cries.
No, I think they as several elite forces in history have done, they discovered the power of silence. The Romans often would do the same thing. Now, the Greeks were very aware of the mountain track that could be used to outflank their position at the middle gate, which is a gap so narrow, Herodotus tells us, that only a single cart could go through. But the Persians at this stage were not aware. So Leonidas sent 1,000 Phocians to guard that route. The Persians arrived, but again, not really depicted in the movies. They actually left the Spartans and their allies sweating for 5 days after they'd arrived. Messengers did offer terms. They did assure Sparta retaining her place in the forefront of the Greek cities, but all offers were rejected. And this is where Herodotus has another wonderful laconic response from Leonidas. When a herald grows impatient and demands that the Greeks lay down their weapons, Leonidas replies, "Come and take them." Now, in the movie, we have a response to a Persian ambassador's threat, and let's just hear that one now.
Our arrows will blot out the sun.
Then we will fight in the shade.
Now, according to Herodotus, it's not a Persian herald, but a Greek ally familiar with the Persians' tactics, who is said to have warned the Spartans that the Persian arrows will blot out the sun, which is when Dienekes, a Spartan warrior, is said to have replied, "Good, then we will fight in the shade," or so Herodotus tells us. It's also worth noting that Xerxes had an advisor of his own, a former Spartan king, Demaratus, who had been deposed and exiled in 490 BC, and was warning Xerxes not to underestimate Greek soldiers. The depiction of the Greeks as wearing cloaks and underpants is ridiculous. They would have worn full bronze armour, greaves for the legs, breastplates, vambraces for their arms, and helmets that would all have had horsehair crests.
The armoured infantry with the large shields that covered from knee to neck were what gave the name to the Wall of Bronze. And against this wall, when the Persians finally did begin their attack, they just dashed themselves. The cloud of arrows mentioned earlier did happen, and the Greeks literally shrugged them off. This is nothing like the Mongol composite bows that we'd see, 1,500 years later, or the English and Welsh longbows that could punch through plate armour. These were fairly light arrows, and they just bounced off. Another tactic of the Greek phalanx was the coordinated push, and this is one rare occasion where 300 depicts something pretty factual. The weight of the Greek hoplites and the heavy bronze armour and the endless hours of practice and training they underwent made this a simple but very effective tactic. Casualties, even if exaggerated by Herodotus, who, after all, was a Greek historian, would have been horrific on the Persian side, and Xerxes is said to have been distraught at the ruin of his early attacking forces.
Okay, so back to the movie. The narrative now shows the Spartans dug in at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where they hoped to funnel the Persians into a small approach that the Spartans should be able to defend in theory indefinitely. And now the spear-carrying hunchback reappears, revealing himself to be a Spartan who avoided that birth, inspection and destruction ritual applied to all deformed Spartan babies. He is Ephialtes, and despite his deformities and lack of formal military training, wants nothing more than to fight as a regular Spartan soldier, hence his Spartan shield and sword. Leonidas is sympathetic, listens to the hunchback's requests, but dismisses him and explains how Ephialtes can never be a real Spartan warrior, but if he really wants to help, he can hang around and clean up later or tend to the wounded. The angry and jilted Ephialtes storms off.
Then we see a series of attacks by Persian forces against the Spartan defensive position, with each wave of Persian men and arms more numerous and exotic than the last. A few Spartans die, but thousands and thousands of Persian soldiers die a bloody death at the end of a Spartan spear or sword. The movie shows the engagements as slow-motion splatterfests, justifying the R rating. In between the waves of Persians assaulting the Spartan position, we also see an intrigue going on back in Sparta. Leonidas' wife, Gorgo, wants to speak before the all-male Spartan council to get them to officially declare war on Persia and send the full might of Sparta's army to support her husband. She seeks the assistance of Captain Artemis, who promises to help, just as the corrupt Theron appears.
Okay, cut back to the battlefield. Xerxes himself now appears at the narrow pass at Thermopylae before Leonidas. Xerxes is played by Brazilian actor Rodrigo Santoro. In the movie, Xerxes is shown as like a tall, exotic and effeminate thing, maybe 7 foot tall. He has chains and body piercing across his face and upper body. He is menacing in some sort of homoerotic way towards Leonidas, who swats away the peace and prosperity that Xerxes offer, should the Spartans surrender, with a few of his barbs and a few clever lines. So again, the Spartans are offered peace and prosperity, and again they decline. So several more waves of Persian attacks follow, with increasingly ferocious and fantastical warriors. This includes sort of an 8 foot tall, snarling super soldier, described by one critic as being the
Lord of the Rings cave troll.
Borrowed from Middle-earth, yeah, especially by Xerxes. The battle scenes also include some sort of armoured giant rhinoceros, grenade-wielding magicians, and some armed, raging and rampaging elephants. The Spartans do endure a few casualties, but persevere, all again shown in bloody slow-motion detail. And then Xerxes unleashes his immortals.
They have served the dark will of Persian kings for 500 years. Eyes as dark as night. Teeth filed to fangs. Soulless. The personal guard to King Xerxes himself. The Persian warrior elite. The deadliest fighting force in all of Asia. The Immortals.
And there you heard us deploying our false and true sound effects. So what is the reality? The Immortals were a corps of elite Persian soldiers, the height of achievement for a warrior in those times. They certainly didn't sharpen their teeth into fangs, and they hadn't been serving the dark desires of the Persian kings for 500 years, because let's face it, the Persian Empire had been established by Cyrus the Great, and Darius, who was Xerxes' father, was very much alive during Cyrus's reign and was one of his army commanders. So this is pure fantasy. The name Immortals was ascribed to them by Herodotus and other contemporary historians and playwrights, and they suggest it's because there was always 10,000 of them, casualties being instantly replaced from a pool of suitable reserves. But this may well be incorrect, because there's no record of the name or this policy amongst what records have been found from the Persians themselves. Some modern historians have suggested that Herodotus and his sources confused two similar sounding Persian words, Anusia, meaning companions, with Anorsa, meaning immortal. So it may well just be that they were the companions, which is what Alexander called his cavalry bodyguard. These troops were Persia's heaviest infantry, but even with their better armour and weapons, they still found themselves balked and beaten by the Greek line, although they started to inflict more casualties on the Spartans and their allies than the previous attempts had managed, largely because, as with the other Persian troops, their courage was absolutely incredible, and this is noted several places by Herodotus. The Spartans said these guys they don't lack courage or ability, they just lack the equipment. War rhinos? No, never been used by any armies in the history of the world as far as we can tell. War elephants certainly have been used, but they weren't at Thermopylae because Xerxes wasn't stupid and he knew it was a very narrow path they were going to have to traverse.
Okay, back to the movie. We now get to see Xerxes' court, and that jilted hunchback, Ephialtes, he appears and offers to betray Leonidas and show the Persians the alternate path around the Thermopylae that the Spartans are defending. Xerxes' court is shown to us as some sort of exotic and depraved place where the hunchback clearly belongs. Then again, the action cuts back to Sparta, where the corrupt Theron confronts Gorgo, seeking to prevent her from addressing the council. Remember, he's been bribed by Xerxes and wants to prevent Sparta declaring war at all costs. Theron intimidates Gorgo and then clearly rapes her, according to the movie.
Meanwhile, back at Thermopylae, Leonidas learns of the hunchback's treachery, and the Spartans prepare for a nighttime assault by the Persians. At this point, Leonidas banishes our narrator, Dilios, from the battle, entrusting him with his narrator role to tell Sparta and the rest of the Greek-speaking world of the 300's valiant but doomed last stand. The next day, Gorgo finally addresses the assembly, pleading with them to declare war on Xerxes and send reinforcements to her husband. Theron turns the tables on her, accusing her of whoring herself behind her husband's back. She attacks him physically and stabs him in a fury. Persian gold coins cascade out of Theron's tunic, revealing his betrayal to the councilman as he dies upon the council floor.
So back at the battlefield, the movie shows the Persians trying diplomacy one last time. The hunchback, Ephialtes, and an unnamed emissary are in front of Xerxes and offer Leonidas peace, wealth and prosperity if he and the Spartans accept Xerxes as their ruler. Leonidas starts to relent, starts to discard his weapons, and seems to collapse before Xerxes, but of course it's all a ruse, and Leonidas and the Spartans lash out one last time at the Persians. At close quarters, the Spartans are slaughtered to a man by Xerxes' archers and his bodyguards. Leonidas and his men die in front of us in slow motion glory.
Reality check.
Yeah.
Ephialtes was the name ascribed to the traitor that revealed to Xerxes the existence of the track that led to the rear of the Greek position, and he's described by Herodotus as the son of Eurydemus of Malice. No one mentions he's a former Spartan or he's deformed or anything like that. He's just a local, I believe. Some sources say he was a shepherd, and he would have probably done it because to him, who ruled that bit of land that he farmed, didn't really make any difference, and he was probably hoping for a reward. Ephialtes was later killed for an unrelated matter by Athenades of Trachis. There had been a price on Ephialtes' head. Athenades did receive a reward from Sparta. The traitor's name is now used in modern Greek for nightmare and is also applied to traitors to this day, so you won't find many Greek kids being named Ephialtes.
Okay, the Phocian guard that Leonidas has placed on the track were overwhelmed by the arrival of the immortals, supported by archers, and so they retreated to a hill where they were largely ignored by the passing Persian troops. The Phocians did, however, manage to send a runner to warn Leonidas. Most of his contingent was sent away by the Spartan king to get home and join the gathering main force, or so Herodotus tells us. It may be that they simply decided to leave, realising that their situation was hopeless. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, however, stayed, along with the Thespians and some other reluctant Thebans, who would subsequently surrender to the Persians before the final battle. The remaining total force is reported to have been just over 1,000 hoplite soldiers.
They fought for a further full day, during which Leonidas was killed and a vicious fight erupted over his body. And finally, the remaining Greeks formed up on a small hillock, and this is where the modern memorial to the battle is found. And they were gradually whittled away until they were all dead. The history is telling us that Xerxes finished them off from very close range with his archers. So some 20,000 Persian troops had died to defeat this small elite force, so we estimate. But why did Leonidas choose to stay once he knew he was about to be surrounded? It may be to do with the prophecy from the oracle at Delphi, as the Spartans were famously pious and tried to obey the god's will in all things. Or it may have been a very practical decision, or a combination of the two. Because if all the Greeks had left, the Persian cavalry, which was their most effective combat arm, would have quickly caught up the slow-moving heavy infantry and could quite possibly have butchered them all. So Leonidas' decision, if it were to delay the Persians, worked as the escaping Greeks did make it back to their respective main armies. Leonidas' body was beheaded and crucified, very unusual for Persians because they did have a practice of honouring brave enemies. Possibly this is a sign of their frustration at the small force that had held them up for so long.
Okay, so the final closing scenes of the movie, let's quickly return there. Once we've seen the 300 have been defeated and murdered and slaughtered, the movie moves back to Sparta, and Gorgo, Leonidas' wife, meets our narrator Dilios, and Dilios confirms her worst fears about her husband and the 300. So all that remains of the movie is to prove that the death of Leonidas and the 300 was not in vain. We see Dilios addressing the Spartan assembly with some rousing words about defiance and bravery, and before we know it, Dilios is saying those same words in front of a combined rampaging Greek army about to attack Xerxes in the decisive, and as history tells us, Greek victory at the Battle of Plataea. Roll credits.
And not only Plataea, but Salamis were two actual battles that happened in the immediate aftermath of Thermopylae.
Yeah.
After Xerxes' army cleared the way at Thermopylae, they advanced on Athens. The Athenians evacuated nearly the whole population to the island of Salamis, just off the coast. And the Persians went about destroying the city of Athens. A naval battle took place at Artemisium, which, although not decisive, was a fairly clear victory for the Persian fleet. Under command of Themistocles, a very impressive Athenian naval commander, the remaining Greek fleet managed to entice the Persians to try and block each end of the narrows between Salamis and the mainland. Here, in very restricted waters, the Persian numbers hindered their freedom of movement, and the Greeks scored an emphatic victory.
I don't know if you can hear the cuckoo clock of destiny telling us we've been at this for over an hour, Martin.
Absolutely.
Anyway, a lot to unpack, as you said. So Xerxes then hightailed it back to Persia, leaving his senior commander Mardonius in command of his army, with orders to continue the assault on Greece the following spring. Mardonius was killed and his army utterly defeated by a combined army of Greek allies in 479 BC at Plataea. The Greeks at Plataea numbered about 40,000 strong, and they were led by Pausanias, a regent to Leonidas' son, who himself was too young to have taken command, at the head of some 5,000 Spartans.
After this defeat, the Persians never again came west of the Hellespont, and all Greece lived in peaceful independence, until Alexander and his Macedonians overran them 150 years later, and then the Romans after them. And then after the collapse and the retreat of the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Turks, who ran the area right up until the Greek Revolution, which saw the Greek mainland recognised as an independent nation in 1832. The Greek islands, as we refer to them today, in the eastern Mediterranean, which is primarily the Dodecanese, were left out of the agreement over Greek independence, so they remained under Turkish rule until 1912, when they were occupied by the Italians, who remained after World War I, until World War II, when in the aftermath they were finally reabsorbed into the Greek state. And I couldn't help chuckling, because I did read that Dodecanese literally means 12 islands, and yet the Dodecanese consists of 15 large islands, 150 smaller ones, of which 26 are inhabited. So there we go, the conclusion.
Frank Miller, on whose 1998 graphic novel this movie is based, said quite openly he is not a historian, he is just a graphic novelist. Is a graphic novel an attempt to give a grown-up name to what we would have called a comic book? I guess so. Miller has been accused of being anti-Islamic, homophobic, misogynistic, and quite openly describes some of his works, notably 2006's Holy Terror, as patriotic propaganda. Zack Snyder has repeatedly denied that he had any political direction or message in mind when adapting 300 for the screen, simply saying that this goes to show how everyone takes a different message from a movie.
This came out in 2006. George Bush was a year into his second term, having declared victory in Afghanistan and Iraq, which, is open to interpretation. To me, I just found it was ridiculous, biased propaganda. When I first saw it, I was sort of like, it's Quentin Tarantino-esque cartoon violence, sort of splatterfest. Yeah, it's all right. And I just accepted the change of the historical facts, which I knew were wrong then. But having researched it and watched it again with a more analytical eye, I just didn't enjoy it at all. It's just
propaganda, as you say.
It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And trying to make out that the Persians were these, drugged automatons, it actually detracts, because Thermopylae, it was a defeat for the Greeks. They lost. They didn't hold the pass. But the morale effect, and, it is such a classic, particularly Western civilization, the brave last stand, laying down your life so that your friends may live, and no greater love hath a man, and he does that. And it had such an impact, and it did have a huge impact on the Greeks at the time.
It's one of those turning points in Western civilization where we're seen as just, escaping being overrun by the exotic people from the East by the skin of our teeth, whether that's the Persians 500 BC, whether that's the Ottomans a couple of millennia later. There is this constant threat in the West of invasion from the East.
Yeah.
And, various people have claimed to have, defended democracy, or a democratic tradition would have been wiped out by these invaders from the East. This does fit with that narrative where they're strange and exotic people, and it's exaggerated to the nth degree. But what I found slightly amusing was the portrayal of Xerxes as some sort of homoerotic giant, and at the same time, Leonidas' character kind of looks down his nose at the Greek boy lovers. There's this kind of defiant, masculine, homoerotic stance by the Spartans, but it's pretty well established by historians that the Spartans themselves encouraged male bonding within the army, that there was a homosexual tendency within the Spartans, because I think the theory was that, sure, you might fight hard for your country, but you'll fight even harder for your lover that's next door, sort of thing.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That's completely glossed over in the movie.
And also the coming of age thing with the wolf. What the boys in the Agogi were actually told to do, they had to sneak out, steal, which showed that they could forage and live off the land, as it were, and they'd only be punished if they were caught. But their coming of age thing was to murder a helot, a slave.
Oh, really?
It's not clear whether every single boy did that, but they certainly had there's a secret society, and the name escapes me, it's Karaki or something like that, which was a group of the most promising Agogi inmates or students, And their job was to go and terrorise helots and keep them in their place. If there was any hint of insurrection, go and murder the ringleaders. And interesting, looking forward, within a few years, Sparta became very jealous of Athens, who became a great naval power at this stage through necessity, and actually sided with the Persians to fight Athens, and we had the Peloponnesian War, which basically ended up destroying Athens. The Spartans pop up again and again, but after Thermopylae, after the Peloponnesian War, they were pretty much on a downward trajectory. But yeah, strange, almost a social experiment, and they definitely indulged in eugenics, but then a lot of other people did. They're getting rid of any children who were deformed. If people want to know more about this, we've got a few bits and pieces, other than what we mentioned in the introduction. There will be links on the show notes. But I can heartily recommend, if you want some very well-researched historical fiction, Christian Cameron, who's an American author, and he's a, what do they call the people who dress it? Reenactment expert. And he has stood in replica Greek uniform and armour and trained hour after hour after hour. And he says it's exhausting. Sure. But he's written, one of his series is The Long War, and this covers a character called Arimnestos from Plataea, right from before the Ionian Revolt, before the Marathon, through Marathon, and he's just got to what probably will be the conclusion, which is Plataea. Right. And they are brilliant reads. So if anybody wants to know more about the era, but maybe doesn't want to read Herodotus or a dry history, and Christian Cameron does say at the end of each book, okay, these are the bits that are changed to suit the fictional narrative. Right. And he's very clear, and he's a great writer. So
he could continue on to the Peloponnesian War. That was immediately after the defeat of the Persians, or a couple of years after, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't long. Certainly no more than 5 or 10 years.
Then goes on for another 20 years itself, I think.
And also, it's worth noting as well, one of the most incredible books I read as a teenager getting into history was Xenophon's Anabasis. Xenophon, who was one of our quoted sources for this, lived a few years later.
Almost contemporary,
Yeah, almost contemporary. He'd have known, as a young man, he'd have known some old men who would remember, not the last day of Thermopylae, but maybe the early stages of it. But he was a soldier and a historical writer. He was a member of a group of 10,000 Greek mercenaries who marched into Persia around 400 BCE to support another Cyrus, who was trying to usurp his elder brother Artaxerxes from the Persian throne. Cyrus got killed, and the subsequent fighting retreat of the 10,000 Greeks was recorded by Xenophon in his book Anabasis, and it's just begging to be made into a film. You know, hopefully Ridley Scott's listening to this. Hopefully Zack Snyder isn't.
Okay, that brings us back to the film.
Yeah.
So it did get some elements historically correct. The name of the traitor that betrayed the Spartans, the Hunchback in the movie, his name was correct with a historical traitor.
Yeah. Theron, by the way, in case anyone hadn't realised, is completely fictional. There was a Theron mentioned in some of the ancient histories, but he was a tyrant in Sicily, so nothing to do with Sparta.
But Gorgo was Leonidas' wife. The stuff about being taken from your family at the age of 7 when you're a soldier and brutalised, that had some elements of truth to it. But, wrapping it up, what are we thinking, summary?
I mean, entertainment, and I'm trying to balance this when I first saw it. So this is entertainment for someone who's not looking at it with an analytical, historical eye, just as someone watching it. I was like, yeah, it's all right. Now it's almost in the minuses, so I've balanced that out and given them a 3 for entertainment.
Out of 10.
Out of 10.
Yeah, right.
Historical accuracy, just looking at the Greek and the Spartan side, they were sort of pushing up towards a 5. But again, with the Persians, they're on at least a -3. It's ridiculous. Yeah. If anybody, unfortunately, we don't have anywhere near as many written records from the Persian perspective as we do from the Greek. So everything we read is very, very one-sided. The victors write the histories, and as Churchill said, I intend to be treated well by history because I intend to write it. So historical accuracy, I've given them 2.
Well, for me, I mean, I hadn't seen this movie when it was in release, and you might recall the first pod that we did on Gladiator, and I recall at the time seeing that, thinking this is pretty violent, lots of blood and unnecessary graphic violence, and saying that about Gladiator, and now looking at the 300, I have to eat my words on the Gladiator at least. It was very bloody, very gory, very graphic, very cartoony. Entertainment, probably agree with you, 3 out of 10.
Yeah.
And historical accuracy, maybe the same, maybe 3 out of 10. Neither of them are good scores.
No, so they get 2.5. Certainly, I side with it. I mean, maybe we should consider. Look, we're middle-aged amateur historians with an eye to the real story, and this is aimed like graphic novel. No, it's a comic book. It's a strip cartoon made into a movie, and it's aimed at pre or just post-pubescent boys, I suspect.
Sure. And it did the job well and made a lot of money. Made 450 million after costing only 65. So it did the job.
Yeah,
just not aimed at us. Not surprisingly.
No. So looking forward to a fortnight's time, and we're moving to a very different era, a very different style of film, I'm glad to say, but still keeping a war theme, and we're going to be looking at 1955's Dam Busters movie, directed by Michael Anderson, starring Richard Todd and Michael Redgrave. And joining us we're going to have our first guest host, and I'm delighted to say that it's going to be Ray Harris, who's the host of the World War II podcast series, which is incredibly well researched and detailed, and he's also a co-host with Cameron Riley on The Life of Caesar, Life of Alexander, the Cold War, and a philosophical series called The Three Illusions.
So it's a great addition to the podcast.
Yeah, definitely. So we will speak to you in a couple of weeks' time, or we'll speak at you in a couple of weeks' time. I hope both of you are well, our dear listeners, and we'll speak to you soon.
Cheers.